Well, I'll try to email the slides. That seems to be the easiest.
Okay, good. Did you see there was one microphone for you, one for the audience?
Okay.
The Q&A.
Okay, cool.
Don't hesitate to stick the microphone on the chin to have a louder voice.
All right.
Also for the stream.
Okay, got it.
And as usual, before to start the upgrade of the streaming, when he said okay,
Okay, sounds good.
we can start. Okay.
Let's see. Okay. I just need to figure out how to export to a single PDF file.
All right, yeah, Figma's kind of bad for that, I suppose.
Well, I think there was the way to do that. Actually, I can do this. Just can do this. No.
I guess it could be just like in some of like PNGs even. If you
Okay,
can
yeah.
do that, because then like you could full screen them and then
Yeah, certainly.
just put like in a folder, I suppose.
Okay. Let's see. No, that's still not exactly what I want.
Each page is a different frame.
Yeah, that's it. Just like tries to export this like as every page is a different PDF, which is not cool. Well, actually, I guess I can do merge PDF online, something like that. And then
Yeah, I think it would work separately though.
yeah, but like sending 13 files separately, I guess
Yeah,
not
true.
super
If
convenient.
it's in a folder, suppose. I don't know, like because you can do Google Drive for this.
Oh, okay. Let's see. It's from 1 to 13. Okay, I think that should work. Okay, I think that worked.
Oh, dope. Nice.
Okay, sweet. So where do you send it?
To this email, contact at Ethereum-friends.com. So
One sec, contact
at Ethereum.
at ethereum.com. Okay, sweet. Did you get it? Oops. Could go to spam, I guess. Looks good. Oh, okay, that's awesome. All right. Yeah, I'll put my laptop on. How much time do you have? What do you start?
Well, yeah, but start now, I guess.
Okay, I'll just put my laptop in.
Right, so yeah, I suppose.
Okay, perfect. All right, 1, 2, 3. Is that working? Okay, perfect. All right, I guess I'm gonna start now. So my name is Alex, and I'm the CTO and co-founder at Ethereum. And today I'm gonna talk a little bit about returns of investing in DeFi versus just holding some crypto such as Ethereum or Bitcoin. So first of all, I just want to show the chart of Ethereum price over the last year. So that is from March last year until today. So, and the results are going to be a lot affected by that because all the returns are compared as if you were to invest last March, to be precise, on the 3rd of March last year, and it was almost at the very bottom. And so like over the year, the price of Ethereum was almost always higher than that point. So that's why the results are kind of affected a lot by that. So that is just something to keep in mind, because right now the price of Ethereum, as most of you probably aware, is around 220. Last year, the same date, it was about 130 or so. And just a few words about DeFi. It seems to be the most popular application of Ethereum these days, and it got lots of traction over the last year. And there are like lots of instruments that came around that allow you to better manage your risks. And some of them, the most prominent ones, are Compound, tokens, and Uniswap pools. Those are the ones that I'm going to compare in terms of investment returns later on. But before we go forward, I just want to say that the whole DeFi thing is pretty early stage, and it's not a final product, so anyone who decides to invest in DeFi must be aware of multiple risks. One risk is economical. Lots of protocols are developed based on certain assumptions, and it's really hard to predict how market is going to behave if one piece of that breaks. And so it's pretty risky, and also there's like a technical risk as always, because you need to trust a code. There could be many bugs, and as recent examples of BZX show, it's never reliable completely, so investors in DeFi must be aware of that. But let's get started. So the key takeaways of this talk is that with the arrival of DeFi, it's easier now to actually manage your risks while investing in crypto. Because until now, the only thing possible was to decide whatever crypto you like the most, but then the growth of crypto was primarily based on pure speculations. So except for speculation, there was not much actually affecting the price. While now there are like some products that you can understand how exactly they work, where the profit comes from, and based on that you can just make certain decisions. Another thing interesting takeaway from here is that actually certain automated strategies such as SET protocol and such as moving average crossover, it actually outperformed Ether over the last year if you invested in it. So it correlated a lot, but it still shows better returns than just investing in Ethereum. And I'm gonna show a little bit later. And the last point is that with the appearance of products such as Compound, it became pretty easy. If you don't really want to take the risk of price volatility, you can just deposit certain stablecoins such as DAI or USDC, whichever you prefer, and then you can just earn very low but very stable interest on top of that. And so first thing I want to talk about is Compound. As most of you probably heard of, it's a protocol that basically a money market with pooled liquidity, and anyone can supply liquidity in 1 out of 8 supported assets, and then whenever you take it back, you get some interest on top of that. So I'm specifically interested in Compound DAI pool, which basically means that you put your DAI into the pool, which is a stable coin, which price is almost equal to $1 over time. And as the last year showed, the average APR was around 7%, which means if you just put some DAI into Compound, by now you will have 7% returns on top of that. And just to show the size of the protocol, they originated $240 million worth of loans since their appearance slightly more than a year back with their second version of the protocol. And right now the size of the market is $42 million worth of outstanding loans. And here is the chart over the last year that shows certain performance. So we assume that if we put $10,000 slightly more than a year back into Compound, then the red line is going to show our actual balance, which will be around 10,800 by the moment, and it steadily grows. another interesting thing is the interest rate, which is flexible and that changes all the time. But as I showed at the previous slide, if you average it over the year, it will be around 7%. However, as you can see, it's pretty volatile. So it can be as high as 17% at the very beginning, but it also can drop almost to 2%, which is super low. But on average, it still produces 7% of interest, and that's probably the most conservative investment that you can do into DeFi. And just to mention that as well here, Compound is not the only protocol allowing you to do that. There are actually a bunch of alternatives such as DYDX, where you can also invest your money in. There was BZX, but recently it was broken, so I guess I wouldn't recommend doing that. And there's also Aave that also kind of provides similar functionality. The next thing I would like to talk about is Uniswap. And maybe some of you know Uniswap as an exchange, but what I'm more interested in right now is to look at it not as an exchange, but as an opportunity to invest money in. Because it's basically liquidity pools that exist on chain, and people can trade using those pools, but in order to let people trade, someone needs to supply liquidity. And you can choose whichever pool you like, and then you need to deposit equal amount of Ether and whatever the other token is traded in that pool. And again, I'm going to look at Ethereum DAI Uniswap pool, which means that by doing investment in that pool, you need to supply the equivalent amount of ETH and DAI in US dollars. So you need to, let's say, supply $5,000 in ETH and $5,000 in DAI, and then based on that, you can track your returns. And also, just to give the overall overview, there is currently, and yeah, so you make the profit from the fees. So once you supply liquidity into the pool, then other people trade using that pool, and from every trade happening out there, there is a small cut of 0.3% that gets distributed between people supplying liquidity to the pool. So over the last year, since February 2019, there was 1.5 million US dollars collected in total, split between all the liquidity providers. And just to show the size of the protocol, there's about 16 very liquid pools that have more than 1,000 ETH invested in them. And there's like over 50 pools with at least 100 ETH locked in them. And the total liquidity at the moment is around 57 million US dollars. And here again are the returns. And here the math is pretty interesting, because if you remember the first chart that I showed, that showed the price of Ethereum, like around July, it went pretty up high, and until that moment, the returns of Uniswap investment was pretty stable. But once the price dropped, which was around here, so here's when the Ethereum price dropped, and that was the moment when actually Uniswap investment turned out to be pretty profitable, because the way the investment works, like the perfect scenario for you is that you withdraw your money from Uniswap when Ethereum price is almost at the same level when you invested. So when there is a huge decline in Ethereum price from the moment when you invested into a pool and now, then you're not seeing many returns. But once the price starts coming back to the same value, so it was like 150, let's say, when you invested, then it raised a lot, so you didn't see much of returns in Uniswap. But once it started going back down to whatever 200, suddenly you started seeing many returns. And another line on this chart is basically a green line is a cumulative net return. That is basically how much fees are getting collected by the protocol. And the impermanent loss is basically the decline of the price. So you see that when the price of Ethereum was super high, the decline was very high as well. And yeah, so like over the last years, you can see you would have made approximately 15% on top of your investment. And potentially, surprisingly enough, if Ethereum price is going to drop down again, those returns compared to Ethereum will even increase. But on the other hand, if Ethereum price is starting to grow right now, those returns are going to be pretty negligible comparing to just investing in Ethereum itself. And the last thing I would like to touch on is the SET protocol. SET protocol is one of the most interesting products available in DeFi these days because they provide automatic strategies. Basically, the way it works, they have multiple token sets. They have around 50 different strategies at the moment, and the way it works, they usually consist of multiple assets. Let's say it could be 50% Ethereum, 50% stablecoin, or like 75% Bitcoin, 25% Ethereum. And the way it works, there is certain algorithm encoded in that strategy that rebalances the underlying assets depending on market conditions. And the strategies I'd like to look at are actually called, what are they called? MaCo, which stands for Moving Average Crossover. Basically, there are like specifically two strategies that I'd like to discuss. It's 20 days moving average crossover and 50 days moving average crossover. Basically, the way those strategies work is that they consist of Ethereum and DAI as underlying assets, and whenever the price of moving average over the last 20 or 50 days, depending on the strategy, crosses the certain line, then the strategy rebalances and either buy more Ether or sells it back to DAI. And as I mentioned in the very beginning, that was pretty interesting that again, if you remember the very first chart of price of Ethereum, this chart is very correlated, which is quite understandable because what the strategy does, it buys Ethereum for you and sells it, depending on certain algorithm, and it almost always holds some Ether as part of the strategy. So there is no surprise that there is a pretty high correlation between the price of Ethereum and the returns of this strategy. But what is more interesting is that actually over the last year this strategy outperformed just holding Ethereum, which I find pretty interesting and inspiring. And again, here is just like the red line, the main line is just the value of $10,000 invested in December 2018. So if you did that back then, by now you would have had almost 26,000, which is like 260% return. So that is pretty cool. And this is just the summary of everything I just discussed, just to compare things. At the bottom, just to compare, I also showed how much you would have made by simply holding Ether and Bitcoin. And since the last year was pretty bullish and the price grew quite a lot, even simply holding Bitcoin, you would have made pretty decent 130% return, but that's not always the case because you never know what the next year is going to be. And the four strategies up there are the ones that I just discussed. So the compound one is super conservative and it gives pretty low return compared to all of the others, but that's just, again, because the year was pretty bullish and crypto itself grew a lot. But also, the cool thing about the compound strategy is that the lowest value was the 10,000 that you invested, so it can never go back. It's super conservative, and when the market is not this bullish, it's also a nice option to invest in. And as I said, the MaCo strategies provided by TokenSat, they actually outperformed significantly the price of Ether. While there was only 70% increase in price of Ether since last March, there was almost 160% of profit using one of the strategies, and you would have ended up having almost 26,000 out of 10,000 invested. And Uniswap DAI pool also does not look this cool compared to all the other strategies, but also it's a very unique strategy that actually comparable to investing in some shares and expecting dividends in a way, because the main return that you get from investing in Uniswap pool is actually how much how well the exchange performs, how many trades are happening there, and depending on how much volume goes through the pool you invested in, the more fees you collect, and in the end, it might be also a pretty interesting thing to do. And I guess I'll just, follow us on Twitter, it's Zeren_IO, and I guess I'm just gonna keep this slide for now while I'm answering questions so that anyone can see that. Yep, thank you for now.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. What do you think of Curve and their project?
Curve is pretty amazing. I love their product and it's super recent, so I didn't include this in the slide. But actually, what they did is they kind of created a similar product to Uniswap, but specifically for stable coins. And the main drawback of Uniswap investments is what I said, is if the price of one of the assets goes far away from what the point was when you invested in. With Curve, it's pretty much virtually impossible because it's for stable coins. It's like DAI versus USDC, which are supposed to be stable, which means there is no expected price decline. And the math under the hood is pretty similar. And yeah, so that's also definitely a cool opportunity out there, but it's relatively new, so I did not get a chance to include it into my slides. So maybe next time I present that, Curve is going to be there too. There's one more question over there, I believe. Yeah, just wait for the mic.
Thank you. So I just wanted to ask you about what about a strategy based on pool together? Because essentially the return would be a little bit better than compound. It would just be more spiky.
Well, pull together is basically a lottery, and it's built on top of compound, and the math expectation of the return is exactly the same, but the difference is that while investing directly in compound, you just get pretty low but stable return, but in pull together, it's like there's a high chance you get 0, there is no way to lose, and there's a tiny, tiny chance that you get the whole thing.
Yeah, but my understanding was that you also have some sponsored money in pool together. So the effective return of pool together is actually superior to compound. I think it's sitting at like 11.5% or something like that, if you account for this sponsored DAI.
Well, I might be not aware about all the details, but based on my understanding, it's purely on top of compound. So the math expectation of the returns is supposed to be exactly the same, but I might be wrong.
Thank you.
Any other questions out there? I guess there's one more in front.
What do you think about arbitrage, and how do you think it could be structured and be a way to diversify the earnings in DeFi?
Well, arbitrage is always going to be there, and I mean, any market has arbitrage because no market is completely efficient, and as long as there are certain inefficiencies in the market, there is going to be arbitrage, and I guess that's a good thing because where arbitrage is, there like money are, so like there are always going to be people trying to take a cut from those different arbitrage opportunities, like there's like different interest rate on different protocols, or there's like slightly different exchange price for the same assets on different protocols. And I guess the coolest thing about DeFi is that everything is so composable, and people can, like the Curve, they can build on top of existing protocols, kind of trying to improve the protocols in terms of like arbitrage opportunities, but it's never going to be perfect because I guess there is no value in fully efficient market, so there's going to be always some arbitrage opportunities, and I guess that is good for a market. Yep, one more there.
Can I ask a question about the business model of the different product that you described? So basically Uniswap, I guess they take a part of the fees. Compound also takes some part of the spread, my understanding.
Well, ideally, or like rather theoretically, right now, they say they don't have any business model at the moment because they're just protocols. And in fact, Uniswap does not take direct fees for themselves, like as a company behind, but they can also do liquidity provisioning on the same conditions as anyone else could do and make money from that. And for Compound, as far as I understand that, so there's a certain security pool, so there's like a certain fee because there's always a spread between interest rates on lending and borrowing, and because of that spread, there's like always some money sitting in the protocol itself. But based on what Compound team says, they are not going to withdraw that anytime soon, and it rather works not as a profit for the company, but more like some kind of security deposit in case something goes wrong. So there's like some spare money sitting in the protocol, kind of to smooth down the situation when everything goes pretty bad and like one of the market crashes or something like that.
And what about sets?
For sets protocol, I'm actually Okay, actually, I do know. So, like for Set Protocol, the business model is that they are coordinating with multiple, also liquidity providers, because basically the way Set Protocol works, there are like automatic rebalancing happening here and there, and people are incentivized to participate in those auctions. And basically, those auctions allow you to buy certain assets from the token set when the rebalancing is happening. And so there is also money in there because it kind of creates arbitrage opportunities mentioned earlier, because when one of the token sets gets rebalanced, then you can supply liquidity. And if you have access to that liquidity and you're actually aware that auction is happening, potentially you can make money out of that just buying some assets from the token set and selling it in the market for a better price.
And I guess a kind of related question, the defensibility on all of these is due to the liquidity, right? Like basically...
Yeah, basically. But also, like just to reiterate again, it's not restricted as a business model for founders, but it's more like an open process. So the founders, like the team, can benefit from that, but also anyone else in the market who is aware, they are also free to participate, and it's actually incentivized and encouraged a lot, because the more competition there is, like the better the rates are, and so it's good for everyone anyway.
All right, cool.
All right.
Another clap, round of applause, I guess.
All right, thank you so much.
There's a lunch break now, and